My name is Thomas Moore. I'm the author of the book, Care of the Soul. And this book, which I wrote about 20 years ago, has been my main work. And since then, I've written 20 books in different aspects of soul. My field is religious studies. When I studied religion, I was particularly interested in the relationship between depth psychology, the arts, and the world's religious traditions. In particular, I've been interested in Greek polytheism and Zen Buddhism. And I was raised a Catholic, so I have that background as well. So I blend a lot of things in my work. I've been a psychotherapist for 30 years. So what I try to do is combine my experience of working with people and very deep personal issues, combine that with my studies in religion and psychology.
Great, thank you.
I began to realize that this is really a good word for, I liked it so much better than talking about the psyche or using kind of a scientific or quasi-scientific language for it. And then I became acquainted with the work of a person who's become a very good friend of mine, James Hillman. And Hillman, one of Hillman's early books was called Suicide in the Soul. And he wrote a great deal about soul. And in a way, he has been my mentor. Whatever it is in us as human beings that accounts for our depth and our individuality. In fact, I like to quote Aristotle. Aristotle says that whatever makes an axe, like this tool that you cut trees down with, whatever makes an axe is its soul. So I apply that to a person. Whatever makes you, you is your soul. That's one aspect of soul. So part of soul has to do with being an individual person, not like anybody else. Just whatever it is in a deep way that accounts for your individuality, that's one aspect of your soul. Let me say a little bit more about what the soul is, because being an individual and accounting for individuality is only one part of it. Another part of it is that the soul is our depth. So that means that if you want to get in touch with your soul, you have to really go deep inside. It's not a superficial idea. It's in fact our depth as people. So that means something like the depth of our feeling, the depth of our thoughts, our deep history, depth itself of any kind. And it's an inexhaustible depth. You never get to the bottom of it. So that's what's interesting about soul, is that when you deal with a person's soul, you're dealing with something that you will never, ever completely figure out. All of these qualities have a lot to do with how then you respond to soul in all the many instances where you want to. You have to remember how deep it is, that it takes a poetic sensibility to appreciate it, and that the arts are very important and dream as a means of getting to know what the soul is. Creativity is an issue that I've been very, very much interested in. And the way I understand creativity is not just being original and coming up with new ideas, but more getting in touch with oneself in a deep enough way that you really touch your individuality. And you find ways either of being in the world or of expressing yourself or doing work that comes out of that individuality. So it has a lot to do with looking at the creative person. It's not so much the creative work, but you have to be a creative person. And so it's not about mental brilliance, it's about going deep enough that you can actually appreciate and be free enough to be your own person and to be loyal to that person that you see. And if you're faithful to that person, then whatever you do will have an element of creativity in it. And it takes a lot of faith in yourself, constantly. To trust your vision, your quirkiness, your individuality, and even when people tell you that you're wrong or that you're in the wrong direction or that you should be doing something else, if you are faithful to that individuality that you know to be deep in your heart, I think that's the the best kind of creativity.
So there's a sort of authenticity.
Authenticity has a bit of a moral tone to it, like I should be real and genuine. I don't think that's a good place to be. I think I should also be clever and disguised and shadowy. Authentic is too clean for me, for my taste. So I don't like to use the word. In my work, I often talk about the Greek god Hermes, who is known as Hermes the thief and the liar and the deceiver. And I understand from this in a deep way that there's something about being creative where you shouldn't be too transparent and you shouldn't try to be totally honest all the time. You should be able to have a shadow quality so that people can't pin you down and that they don't know exactly what's going on and who you are. I think that's better. It's better to be not so authentic, but to be honest with yourself, or not, I didn't even say honest, to be close to yourself, and sometimes that requires that you hide yourself and that you hide your motives. I think that's all right. I would say anything to do with art and images, both in expressing oneself. I shouldn't even say that because I don't think art is really about expressing yourself, but about using art materials and creating images and enjoying those images as something that come from you. I think that is a very important part of caring for the soul in education. So no matter what age the person is who's being educated, whether it's a preschool child or if it's a college student, I think the images in their lives are very, very important. Now the second step would be we tend to teach what the material we teach, we tend to teach it literally. There are just a lot of things going on in modern life that make it difficult to bring soul into play, and one of them is our tendency to take everything as a fact. We tend to understand everything that's said or taught as being real only if it's factual. We don't understand the difference between the real and the literal. We mix those things up. There are certain things that are real that are not so literal. For example, a dream is very real, but it's not literal. When you look at the meaning in a painting, you look at a painting, let's say a bowl of fruit in a still life. It's real, but it's not literal. And some people who even teach art teach that still life as literal, so they want to know about the brush strokes and how realistic the fruit is. Well, all of that is about the literal fruit. But what about that bowl of fruit, if that's what is painted? What about that as poetry, as a little poem? What does it suggest? And what is the context? What about this painting gives you a more poetic, a deeper sense of an object? So I think the tendency to be literal is the worst thing, and it's throughout education. Another thing is that we want to be practical and functional. And so we want to teach students so that they can use their information. But maybe it's a good idea to teach things that have no use whatsoever, just for the sheer joy of learning something, and completely forget about using it. I think that would be a much more soulful way of teaching. Use and function get in the way of soul. It's not that we can't have usefulness and function. It's not that you can't study a subject to train yourself to get a job. But if that's all you do, if you limit it to that, then you've lost the soul. Another quality of soul that I haven't mentioned is pleasure. So when you're living a soulful life, you're finding pleasure in life. So I would say that a lot of learning that we do is so earnest and such a struggle that we don't remember that it's important to have pleasure in learning. If we brought more pleasure into the learning process and thought about that the things we learn are going to give us pleasure and make life more pleasurable, that also would lead to soul.
Yeah, that's definitely pleasure is definitely an absent aspect from most educations.
Yes.
Are there educational environments that are more...
You'd have to ask yourself, now, what was the person thinking of when they built that school? What was their fantasy of learning? I think most of the time you would see that it had to do with not being distracted, of being contained and controlled. Probably most of the architecture is for the teachers and the people who run it, not for students. They're not really thinking of students. So how do we get out of it? Well, the most obvious way would be to get out into nature, into another spirit altogether, and nature offers that. My daughter and my stepson went to a Steiner school for their elementary grades, and they spent a lot of time, more time than usual, outdoors, and especially in nature and with animals and that sort of thing. My daughter especially grew up very close to animals. That was a very important part of the education, it seems to me. There's so much to learn. It's not learning facts and learning something you get tested on. It's through contact and touch and smell and that sensuous education. We could bring a sense of home to wherever we're teaching. So any indication of home, instead of separating home from school. See, I don't want to separate home from hospital or home from workplace either. So I wouldn't want to separate home entirely from school. Obviously, they're different places, and they don't have to be the same. But what I mean is we don't have to make such a strong distinction between those two. If we could just bring a little spirit of home into the school, it would help a great deal. Make it feel more like a home instead of an institution. Anything at all that would help that way would overcome that barrier. And besides that, we know that home is such a deeply felt thing. So it is very much part of the soul. It's automatic. You make some place more like home and you've already invited the soul in. Now, I homeschooled my daughter at home, obviously, and it had the effect of incredibly intensifying our relationship as father and daughter. And that's pretty interesting. I think about that in relation to school too, that if we broke away from that institutionalization of education, I think we would have closer relationships among people, among parents and their children, among teachers and the children they're teaching. And even in a community, I think the relationship would be closer, because as it is now, we cut off the school. The schools are a little bit like little prisons. They're separate places. So many teachers and people who run educational institutions, they just think they have to, whatever happens, they have to stick to their curriculum. It's like the rules. The rules are so important. That's where Saturn comes in again. The rules are important. They're not relaxed enough to say, how can I teach these children? They don't want to break any rules. Oh, in many, many ways, the teacher's soul is so important. Because when a teacher teaches, they're really not just imparting information. It's so obvious that a teacher is there in that teacher's whole presence, their relationships, their family life, their hopes for their work life, what they want to accomplish, money, all those things come together and they're present in the teacher. I think a lot of times the teachers tend to be unconscious of how much their whole person is involved in teaching, but students interact with a person, not just with someone who has facts and information to give. They interact with that person, including their unconscious life. And if you follow depth psychology, a lot of the soul life is part of the unconscious life of a person. It's not so apparent. And it has a lot to do with their feeling and their memory and their deep wishes, and their fears. So all of that is in a person, in a teacher. And teachers tend to forget who they are. They try to be this function as teachers rather than persons. It's the same issue with doctors and nurses. They heal as persons in their presence, and patients know that. And it's very important for a patient in a hospital to have, when a doctor lets down the barriers and is present as a person. The same thing would be true for teachers. So I think a teacher would have to learn how to be more present in order to make the education more soulful. And it has to do with that teacher's soul. I don't mean that they have to tell their students everything about themselves. That's not really being present. I'm saying that they could realize that they teach as a person and not just as a function. That would help a great deal. But there's this whole dark side of it that I didn't get into. I mean, because it's such a big area. I've written a book called Dark Eros, which is about the Marquis de Sade. And I treat the Marquis de Sade as someone who has a great deal of insight into the dark side of life. I really honor him, for what he's done. And part of it applies to education and what I do. So just as psychotherapists and psychologists have the opportunity to have someone help them reflect on what they're unconscious about or what's going on in their relationship with their clients, teachers could have the same thing. Teachers could have a group or individual experience with someone who is skilled. There are lots of people who could do it. Someone who is skilled at helping them notice things and see things that they would be blind to. And that would bring soul into the process of the teaching for the teacher. I know from my studies of religion that ritual is a very, very important part of human life. And many societies have had very strong rituals to move from one part of life to another. Sometimes they're major shifts, like going from adolescence to adulthood, or going from, we still have some, when you go from the life of being a single person to be a married person. A wedding is a very important ritual. So I'm someone who is greatly in favor of a very big wedding, or really doing weddings well, really doing it and making the ritual very strong so it affects the person, so they really feel it, that they know they've gone through something. And then maybe entering a job, a new kind of work would be something similar. Going through some sort of ritual, getting a uniform, getting new clothes, having a party, being with your friends in some way, celebrating. The ritual doesn't have to be terribly formal, doesn't have to be done in a church. It could be something quite ordinary. Like, I think a lot of our rituals are very ordinary family type things where you say, let's go out to dinner for this. Or let's buy a new piece of clothing, let's go out and do that. Going to the store could be a ritual. There are lots of ways we do it that are very, very good and very, very strong and powerful. Now, those are the major turning points in a life, and those are important for ritual. And I think a good school would appreciate these changes. So a graduation could be done more than just a formality. It could be a very, really strong, powerful ritual. However, there are also minor rituals all along the line. So in a way, we're always going from one phase to another, in smaller phases, all of us. So ritual is important all along the line. One of the things that I noticed, to use my own example again, is when my daughter was in the Steiner school she was in, one of the things I liked was that they had a stage in their auditorium. And I'd say that all the children were on that stage once a week at least for something. They would get on there to sing, to play music, to be in a play, to recite what was memorized. There was something going on that stage. I felt that the stage was a good place of ritual and rite of passage. Because, I mean, just imagine if you have to go out on stage and, let's say, perform something that you've written, or a song that you've made up, or a song that you have learned, or to be in a piece of Shakespeare or something like that. That's a tremendous ritual. It's very different to go on stage and be there with your family present and fellow students, and to be up there where people are watching you and go through that whole thing. That has a strong ritual component. I thought that was very valuable in the school. So the ritual doesn't have, you don't have to put on a witch's hat or something, or call in the minister or the priest or the rabbi. You don't have to. That's very valuable. But you can do these rituals in more ordinary ways. The important thing is that they actually get through and really touch a person where it counts, and that the person is a little bit different for having gone through it than they were before they experienced it. I would love to see education change quite radically. First of all, I would hope that at all levels we would tone down the emphasis on training. A person who is skilled and trained is not necessarily educated. An educated person, I would say, is someone who's able to be in a community responsibly and with joy, and really understand something about that they are fulfilled in community, and they are fulfilled when they give something to community. I think for myself that when I'm working with clients, I think most of their issues could be resolved if they could start thinking about people outside themselves instead of focusing on their own problems and their own emotions. I think most issues can be dealt with that way. And it makes sense that we have to be able to think outwardly. So I wish we'd drop this notion of training and that the education is in order to make a living. I understand that has to be there as a piece, but it's not the primary piece. And it's not really education. I'd rather save the language of training and skills for getting a job, and talk about education as having to do with becoming a person in community and in society. So that's the major thing. Make that distinction and really then commit ourselves to education and not just training. That's a big change that could be helpful. Another thing I'd like to see would be to essentially scrap the schools and start over. I mean, I don't know how else to do it, because the fantasy of how they're built and created and run and what their purpose is so wrong-headed that you can't just tweak it. We really have to start over. We have to start from the bottom up and imagine what is going on in learning. What is it about? And that would be very helpful. Another thing is that it drives me nuts all the time to hear politicians say that our schools should be, and maybe they don't do it in England as much as they do in America, I don't know, but in America they always say we have to get back to math and science. I would say no, we have to get back to the arts. We have to really get back to the arts, and I would like to see an education in spiritual values as well, because I know as a therapist that a lack of education about religion and spirituality is behind an awful lot of emotional problems. There's a direct line between naive notions of spirituality and sexual issues, for example. And this is the primary matter in people's emotional problems. So if it were my school, I'd say two important subjects are art and religion. But religion understood not as a belief system, but as meanings, exploring meaning and values and a spiritual vision. So I think those things need to be taught primarily. Math and science come down to me in a much lower level. They can be there, but they're not nearly as important as the arts. The arts are what humanize us and help us see our soul. So that has to be primary. It's upside down right now. So that would have to be changed. Teachers have to be educated very differently, therefore. And they would be educated in their person. They would have to be educated to develop into bigger, deeper, richer, more visionary people, persons. So we're interested in a person who's going to teach, and not someone who has a certain bag of tools and a collection of information, the person who is teaching. The knowledge comes through that personhood. But if we don't educate the person, what have we got? You know, we don't really have education taking place. That can be done. You can educate a person. They can be an educated person. And at the same time have skills and be able to teach skills. But the first thing is be an educated person. Well, there's this whole dark side of it that I didn't get into. I mean, because it's such a big area. I've written a book called Dark Eros, which is about the Marquis de Sade. And I treat the Marquis de Sade as someone who has a great deal of insight into the dark side of life. I really honor him, for what he's done. And part of it applies to education because, and what I do is suggest that in medicine and in parenting and so on, that there's a kind of infliction of pain that's necessary. I mean, I'm a musician. I know what it's like practicing scales. It's very masochistic. To have to practice and practice. You can't be outside, and you have a teacher come and tell you to be very controlled in what you do. Teachers have to be rather Sadian, I would say, not sadistic, but Sadian, meaning that they inflict pain, and in a good sense. They don't really make. Well, I mean, they inflict pain. They give exams and tests, and they tell you how to do things, and they ask you to practice and do all that sort of thing. Now, it's a slippery slope and a short distance from being Sadian like that, which means the necessity of being dark and inflict some pain, to becoming sadistic, which means that you go over a line and you start really hurting children. Maybe not necessarily physically. When I grew up, though, the nuns used to beat kids, with sticks in school. But now we don't do that. But still, teachers can become sadistic. And I've seen it. I've seen it with my children, how teachers will act sadistically with them and really want to hurt them and destroy them. It's very bad. But it's rooted in the teaching itself. So you have to be careful as a teacher that you understand exactly what you're doing, that there's going to be some discomfort in learning. That's part of it. And you have to be strong enough to be able to direct your students in a way that they will not be terribly comfortable with everything in the learning process. In other words, I don't believe in this kind of a rosy view of the new school where everyone's happy all the time and everything is painless. Education is not painless. But we have to be reflective and thoughtful about the shadow of our work. And the teachers especially then would have to be really careful about their tendency to get angry and to unconsciously inflict pain that is not necessary on their students because of that tendency within teaching itself. There's a shadow in teaching, that's what I'm trying to say. And that would be part of this, of a good kind of supervision or discussion with counselors about education. So, but the point I could repeat is that when I talk about making soulful education, I'm not talking about making it sentimentally beautiful in every respect and sweet. Education doesn't have to be sweet to be soulful. At times it's going to involve a lot of discipline, and discipline is a Sadian word, It's sometimes used to people who beat themselves, discipline, that's a discipline. So I would not like to be misunderstood about that I'm trying to have this carefree kind of education. And it's so ideal that it's just totally beautiful. It's not. Learning entails some pain and some suffering. And teaching is going to involve some capacity to be firm and strong and demanding. That's part of it. That's part of teaching. And if you can't do that, you probably can't be a good teacher. That's also part of soul.